Hey, God bless
Hey,
you.
hey everyone. How you doing, Ezekiel?
Hey Ben, how you doing? Super excited to be here tonight. God bless everyone who's joining us online. How are you
Yeah,
doing, Ben?
I'm good. I'm good. I'm ready to get into it.
Well, good to see you, Ben. I'm really excited for tonight and to be here at TDP Bible Study with you, Ben. And I'm truly thrilled to see everyone who's joining us online. We have a wonderful group. Thank you all for joining us tonight as we continue our journey with the Old Testament. If you guys have been tracking with us, we are today we're going to be entering in the book of Numbers. And so, before we do that, just going to invite you all to maybe share the stream if you can on your social media networks. And then maybe we could get some other people who probably weren't planning to join in on a Bible study. But because of your invitation, then they will. So, if you can go ahead and do that. And Ben, how you're feeling?
I'm feeling good. I'm feeling well, a little overwhelmed, I would say, in a way. And but ready to start getting through it. I know that if anyone here has already read through Numbers, I'm sure that you're feeling many things. And I like if you made it to the end of Numbers, that's awesome. It's really awesome. We talked about in Leviticus. I remember you saying, Ezekiel, how uh, people trying to read through the Bible, we can lose a lot of people in Leviticus.
Yeah.
Largely because it's really dense reading. It's not narrative style as much and things like that. And I think that Numbers presents a similar challenge, though a different nature. We are back to a narrative, but the narrative can be a difficult and troubling one,
Yes.
and so it's a difficult read for a different reason. And so if you guys are here and if you read through it already, or when you hopefully do read through it, just know right off the bat that you're not crazy if it's a troubling read, and it's okay.
Yeah. And just some motivation as we get ready to go forward. I want to just show this chart. Last week we finished Leviticus, which is the middle of the Torah, the first five books of the Bible. And so we're getting ready to go into Numbers. And if you already read Numbers, or now you're going to use this Bible study as a tool for you to journey through, we're already crossing the halfway point of the Torah just by reading verse 1 today. So I just wanted to show you that visually so you can know kind of where you're at. I'm very proud of everyone who's, taking the time out to be here. It is a different approach. This is the first time we do something like this in the history of the Dwelling Place Church. And it's exciting. It is intimidating, but I know God is with us. So without further ado, let's just go into prayer so we could just prepare our hearts and our minds. And then we're going to allow Ben to take it away. So, again, God bless you. Thank you so much for being here. I am thrilled. Let's pray. Dear Heavenly Father, we thank you so much for the grace of today. Father, we thank you for preserving our lives and allowing us to have this moment. We thank you for your spirit and your presence being with all of us individually, but also as a church community. Father, we thank you for your spirit growing us, maturing us, saving us, redeeming us, Lord, sanctifying us. Father, we pray blessing over our entire church family. And today, Lord God, we lift up everyone who is part of this Bible study. I pray for Ben right now as he gets ready to share and teach from your word. I pray that you give him a peace of mind, clarity of thought, Lord. Be with him as he communicates. And Father, I pray for all of us, the listeners, the hearers, Lord, the hearers of your word, Lord. May it not just be a night of gathering information, but may we look to your scripture as wisdom, as life, Lord. Help us, Lord God, to use this Bible study just as a tool to help us to meditate and to know you more. So, Father, I thank you for all that is taking place, things that we cannot imagine. but bless everyone here tonight. And I even pray for anyone who will come across this at a later time. May it be words of life unto them. We pray all of this in Jesus' name. Amen.
Amen. All right. Well, we can get into it. I'll say right off the bat that if you have read through Numbers at this point, you may have felt like it's a fairly chaotic book, and it does come across that way. And so if my walkthrough also feels a little chaotic, I apologize, but I am matching the spirit of the book a little bit.
Yeah.
So just be a little patient with me, and certainly more so, being patient with the book of Numbers. So right off the bat, we'll just it's the book of Numbers. That's what we call it. It's a very English name for the book, and that's our titles come from Greek. But the original name of the book in Hebrew is Bamidbar. I believe it's close. No, it's not close. I'm butchering it. I apologize. But it means in the wilderness, which I have to admit is a much cooler name for this book.
Yeah.
I wish I may continue to refer to this as in the wilderness in the future.
Yeah. The kind of person I am, reading the title of a book called Numbers is definitely like, do I want to read that?
Yeah. And if you just read like the first chapter, you might understand why it's called Numbers. It starts off with a census, and it just gives you the numbers of all of these people. And there's a census. There's two major censuses of Israel, of the warriors of Israel. We'll get into, and there's a census of the Levites. And so there are a fair amount of numbers in this book.
Hence the Greek title, correct?
Hence the Greek title. But I don't think that personally that the title does justice to what the book's really about, and that book. And what the book is about this period of time where the Israelites are traveling through the wilderness, when they're in the wilderness. And so in the wilderness does it justice, I think, quite a bit, even if it's a little bit more of a mouthful than Numbers.
Yeah.
So before I'm planning to walk through essentially the narrative and hit some high points and dive into a few places. As always, please stop us and ask questions. You can type them in the chat, and we'll be keeping an eye out. And even because we don't have time to necessarily go over every story, and especially in Numbers, there's a lot of there's a lot of movements. If you have a question about something that we didn't necessarily touch on ourselves, that doesn't mean you can't ask about that.
Yes.
It just so if you have a question about that, ask it, and we can talk about it, and then first, looking at a large view before we actually start that progression of just what the book of Numbers. I have a diagram here I'm going to pull up. So the book of Numbers can be thought of as having three major sections. The first, and they roughly each takes up about a third of the entire scroll. The first section is about the organization of the camp, and we'll get into it. But there's a census that takes place. God gives commands about who the leaders are going to be of various tribes, how the camp will organize, how it will move once they start moving through the wilderness. Remember, actually, I'll backtrack here in a bit.
Yeah.
Then during the traveling portion, we have this period of them traveling, starting
through the wilderness.
Through the wilderness, in the wilderness, which we'll see later will take place over a period of 40 years. And then once they get to the edge of the promised land, we're going to see the last third of the book is roughly dealing with preparing them to enter the promised land and things that need to be done or understood before they enter the promised land. Awesome. So as a refresher, where are we right now? We are at the foot of Mount Sinai. so the last place that the narrative really left off was at the end of Exodus, if you remember. So um, the Israelites have been enslaved in Egypt. They were delivered out of Egypt by Yahweh through Moses.
Yes.
And Moses has led them to the foot of Mount Sinai, where they have entered into a covenant relationship with Yahweh to be Yahweh's people and for Yahweh to be their God. So they've essentially gotten married with their deity. They've been bound to their deity at the foot of Mount Sinai. And now Yahweh is going to bring them into the promised land, which is the land of Canaan. Which we know about. It was promised to Abraham. Abraham resided in this area for a bit in Genesis, and his family, his descendants, did as well until they, at the end of Genesis, left to go to Egypt due to a famine that was going on, and that's the story of Joseph. So that's where we're at. We're at the foot of this mountain. They received laws, a lot of laws that happened in Exodus. And that was a lot. Leviticus was, instructions for the priests, so they've got. So what we're going to see in this first section is now they're going to be prepared for the travel to the promised land, because there's a specific way in which they're going to do this, because they're not just, as much as we say things like, wandering in the wilderness. There's actually a very structured organization to the way that they're doing this, and God takes that very seriously because he is in their midst now.
Yes.
And because of that, there is important things that have to be done.
Yes.
I know that in the Bible Project, they use a metaphor that I personally like. It's maybe not helpful in some ways, but I find helpful in others, of the idea of like having a nuclear reactor in the middle of your city. There's certain people who are set apart to care for that nuclear reactor, and it's bringing energy to the whole city. But if certain things aren't done, it could become dangerous to those people. So what we'll see is that structuring. So let's get into it. Chapter 1.
Here we go.
Chapter 1. So the first thing that happens is we get a census of all of the people of Israel. Now remember that there are actually 13 tribes of Israel right now. And as a quick overview too, because it's actually very foreign to us now, of course, but back then this structure, if you will, was very familiar. And that's the structure of tribes and tribal groups and people groups.
Mm-hmm.
So you've already seen at this point, this group of people is referred to by a term Israelite. And in English, that's a way to essentially say the descendants of a person named Israel.
Yes.
Which, of course, in the narrative we know is the case. Jacob, who was named Israel, had 12 sons. And then one of those sons, Joseph, had 2 sons who at the end of Genesis are adopted in, if you will.
Mm-hmm.
So there's 13.
Yes, because of that,
there were 12, and then because Joseph had 2, and they came into the place of Joseph, Jacob sort of adopts them almost like as if they are his sons as well. Mm-hmm. There's now 13. So they're all the descendants of a person named Israel, so they're Israelites. But then they're divided into tribes based on which of those sons they all are descendant from. So that's why we've got these tribes of Israel. And then even within those tribes, you'll hear terms like clans or fathers' houses and things like that to further subdivide what particular group you're in. And this is, you'll see it. You see terms like Midianites, right? Again, the implication is that these are descendants of someone named Midian. This is how they saw all people groups around them. Even Egypt is traced back to a person named Egypt in Genesis that we see in genealogies. And I want to put that out there because as we start going through this and these terms become more and more popular, understanding how it is that they identify themselves and people groups that are around them. and it's very much by heritage. And we no longer really define nations that way, not in the West.
Yeah,
Sure.
I actually don't know my great grandfather's name off the top.
Right, exactly. We definitely are not naming ourselves, our identification of who we are based on the name of our ancestor. With the exception of, some could argue that your family name is similar to that.
Sure, yeah.
And we do have leftover things like, you hear last names like Johnson, which is like John's son, or son of John, things like that. But it's very foreign to us in our current cultural context. So I just wanted to put that out there so everyone understands what's being talked about when they say clans, when they say tribes, when you hear anything that's like ends with ites.
Yeah.
Like that. So the first thing that happens is a census is taken of all of the tribes of Israel except one, which is the Levites, and we'll get to them in a moment. And real quick, I'll put up a diagram, or I don't know if diagram is the right word, but here is, so each tribe minus the Levites in the first census and how many people are listed, and in census 2, and then the last column is the difference in the number of people. I just want to bring attention to this at the beginning. It's a good way to see how many people are in each tribe at this moment. But when we get to the second census, which will happen in the last section, you'll notice that there's been some changes to the numbers of people. The overall population of Israel is actually slightly decreased. And certain tribes, such as the tribe of Simeon, have radically decreased the number of people they have.
What happened there? Yep.
Right. While others, such as Issachar and Zebulun, actually have grown.
Yep.
And so even just seeing that, you can say something goes on in the wilderness.
Yeah.
And this is a quick way for you guys to see what those census numbers are.
Yes.
For your notes, there's also this that I'll bring up, and we may come back to this later. This is where I've just organized them by the largest tribe in the first census and in the second census. You can see like the tribe of Simeon, who's the third largest tribe in the first census, is the smallest in the second.
Yeah.
And suffers the most losses. And by losses, of course, it's another generation, which is the second census. It's not the same people being counted. So now remember that tribe that I mentioned? So we now have 12 tribes that have been given a census. There's one more tribe, that's the Levites. The Levites are exempted from this census. Now the census is specifically for all of the men who are 20 years old and upwards. And the reason is because those are the ones who can fight.
Yes, fighting men, right?
Right. Fight men of fighting age. It says that. So it's a census of their warriors. It's how big is our army? Which already, if you didn't already know, clues you into this isn't just going to be a stroll into the promised land.
Yeah.
God's like, count your warriors.
Yes.
So that already clues us into what type of journey, and why it's also so important that he's structuring them properly. They've already been attacked by a group of people as they were coming out of Egypt and going to Mount Sinai, the Amalekites. So it's a hostile world that they're in, and they're going to have to defend themselves, and so God is going to structure them with that in mind, and that's what we're going to see.
Yeah, we highlighted in Genesis how genealogies were important. I guess we can say here now, the census is important.
Yes, the census is important. Now, it's also important who's not in the census, and that's the Levites. God specifically instructs Moses to not list the Levites because they will not be warriors. They are going to be set apart to work the tabernacle. Yes. And we're going to get more into them because there's certainly a lot of information we're given about the Levites. In fact, so we'll come back to them in a moment. But moving into Numbers chapter 2, we get an arrangement of the camp. So the organization of the camp, and I'm just going to bring a diagram because it's going to make it really easy to see. Essentially, we're given this organization. So there's the tabernacle in the middle, and then surrounding them, and this is like, so north is upwards on your screen, and east, which is the direction they're going to be traveling, remember, is to the right side of your screen. So there's the tabernacle in the center, and then surrounding that tabernacle, those are the Levites. Now you see it marked as Merari, Gershon, and Kohath. Those are all clans of the Levites. So again, Levi had 3 sons, Kohath, Gershon, and Merari. And so the Levites are divided into 3 clans. They camp on the back and 2 sides of the tabernacle. And then Moses and Aaron and his sons, who are the priests, they camp in front of the tabernacle. Well, Moses isn't a priest, but I mean Aaron and his sons are priests.
Yes.
And then we've got these other tribes surrounding them. And one thing to note too is that the tribe that's in front, if you will, the grouping of tribes in the front includes Judah, which is the largest of the tribes. That's important too. So that essentially summarizes chapter 2. So we're going to move a little bit.
Yeah.
But I will jump forward a little bit because it's a good time for us for understanding. Because actually, yeah, sorry, I forgot that besides this organization, we're also given information about how they're going to move through the wilderness. So this is how they camp when they sit still. But they're going to set out in a specific order, and that's given to us. So this group that begins there with Judah, they're going to set out first, and then the group at the bottom, which has Reuben in it, it's going to set out behind them. Then the tabernacle and the Levites are going to set out, and they'll be given specific instructions how to do that. And then the other tribes will follow. So you see how they set out in an organized manner, which protects this center part. So it's an army that's marching through the wilderness, and it's organized to be defendable if they are ambushed. So I just want to bring that to everyone's attention. It's very beautiful, and I wish we could spend more time on it. And just
this is not a picnic in the wilderness.
This is not a picnic in the wilderness, and just imagine seeing this organization moving through the camp. I also want to bring our attention real quick to some of the lack of specification that's actually given to us. So you'll see here we organize them, for example, Judah, Issachar, and Zebulun, with Judah on the outskirts, Issachar, and then Zebulun going inwards. The specification that's given to us, that's recorded in Numbers, says that Judah will camp on the east side, and with the camps of Issachar and Zebulun next to it.
Yes.
So, and the reason I bring that up is that that's not actually sufficient information for us to recreate this camp if we were trying to. Perhaps Judah is supposed to be in the center, or perhaps they're not in a line and they're more like pie pieces. We don't know. And that's because this scroll is not, I bring this attention for us to understand the purpose of this scroll for us. It's not written as designed to be used by these people in this camp to create this camp. It's written to record a narrative and to give us information that is important to the meaning of that narrative. Mm. Details in the Bible matter. All of them matter. The biblical authors are not giving you details that aren't important, and all of the details they are giving you are important in some way. So I want to bring that to everyone's just attention so that we can just remind ourselves of what this scroll is and what it isn't. Mm-hmm. All right. We'll pick up the pace here a little bit. We get elaborate duties of the various clans of the Levites, because when they move the tabernacle, specific things have to be moved, and there's specific manners in which they must be moved. Some things can be moved on carts. Some things have to be actually, the most holy things, have to be carried on the shoulders of people.
For example, the Ark of the Covenant.
For example, right, exactly. And so there's specific clans who have different parts of the tabernacle that they're meant to carry. And before they do that, though, they can't physically touch these things. So before they do that, Moses and Aaron and the priests have to go in there and cover them with specific coverings and wrap them up so they're protected and so that no one touches them, because they're these really holy things.
Yeah.
And another important detail we'll get is actually that we get this interesting speech from God where God tells Moses that he's taking the Levites in the place of all of the firstborn of Israel. So
Yeah.
you remember, and God reminds us of it in this passage. This is in the end of chapter 3. When at Passover, when they came out of Egypt, God sent a plague, which was the death of all of the firstborn in Egypt. And the Israelites' firstborn were not taken because God provided a way for them to be delivered from that judgment with the sacrificing of a lamb, the spreading, the whole Passover festival, right? The whole Passover practices. What we are told here is that because of that, all of the firstborn belong to God in some way. But instead of those firstborn, he's going to take the Levites.
Yeah.
And this is so important that he has them count all of the Levites from a month old, and then count all of the firstborn of Israel. And there's slightly more firstborn of Israel than there are Levites. And God has them pay money to the Levites for those extra people.
Yeah.
So this is a very important idea. There's a very important balance that's happening here.
It reminds me of that final chapter of Leviticus that was kind of confusing, where someone could bring a monetary amount of money in place to symbolize a person's life being dedicated over to Yahweh for his service.
Mm-hmm.
So in that sense, there's not enough Levites, there's more firstborns. And so now they're giving this amount in place of, I think there's a connection there. It's interesting.
Yeah, and I think that it's right because there'd be a natural question, I think, of like, wait, there's more. So does that mean that, and the question may come up of like, well, for these people that there's more of, there's 273 more firstborn than there are Levites. Are they not covered? Do they have to come work at the tabernacle? Like, what's going on there, God? And God's like, no, I'm going to release them from that obligation as well. And here's a method by which to do that.
Yeah.
And so that's already setting up this sort of like almost idea that we've seen before and that we're seeing again, which is God's providing a fair way out.
Yeah. And in this sense, Levi, the tribe of Levi, those firstborn go through like a little census themselves.
Yes, right. So we do get a census of the Levites, and it's for this purpose.
Yeah.
And so that's really interesting, I think. I'll take this moment also to say that our prior structure has been, we bring up a lot of key themes that are begun in a book.
Yeah.
And you're not going to really see me doing that right in Numbers. And the reason is that Numbers isn't establishing a lot of its own key themes. It's heavily picking up key themes that have been established and developing them.
Yeah.
There will be a key theme that we will discuss actually towards the end. But I just wanted to bring that up in case we're like, wait, where are all of the key themes?
Yeah.
We're actually now that we're in the second half of the Torah, a lot of the themes have now been established. Yeah. And what will happen now is they're going to evolve and develop.
Yeah. And also too, we provided them so you as a reader can make note of them. And now as you journey, as you read, your mind should be able, or maybe start to pick up, say, oh, here's a theme here. Here's something getting developed a little bit more. So again, our intention is that this is a tool to help you journey. So,
so the Levites have been given their specific duties, what they're going to carry, how they're going to move everything. God then will provide laws, which includes a law that we are familiar with about the Nazarite vow, where anyone can come and essentially become a priest for a set period of time that they decide, and they go through a process and they can serve as a priest during that time. Anyone, man or woman, can do this.
Yeah, very interesting.
Right. And we'll bring this back up as we get into. I'll come back to this, is I guess what I'm saying. The idea that the priesthood is open to any of them and to both men and women. And then that section of the description of what the Nazarite will do when they're going to dedicate themselves, what they do during, how they dedicate, what they do after, what they do if they become unclean accidentally during it, and all that. And then we get Aaron's blessing, the Lord's blessing that we're all very familiar with. Yes. The Lord bless you and keep you. The Lord make his face to shine upon you and be gracious to you. The Lord lift up his countenance upon you and give you peace. And we've all heard that quite a bit, and this is where that comes from.
Yeah.
So now we've got this structure. We know what the camp's going to be, right? We know how it's going to structure, how it's going to move. Everyone's been told, here's how everything's going to work. Here's what you're going to carry. Here's who goes out first. Here goes out last. You guys have the instructions. So now there's just a few things left to do. And that's one, to consecrate the tabernacle, which will be involve sacrifices. All of the tribes bring sacrifices, lots of offerings, sacrifices and offerings to the tabernacle. Just here, like a silver plate, a silver basin, both of them full of fine flour mixed with oil, a golden dish full of incense, a bull from the herd, a ram, and a male goat a year old, another male goat, 2 oxen, 5 rams for another offering, 5 male goats, 5 male lambs a year old. And each tribe, each of the 12 tribes brings that offering.
Yep.
So there just a lot that is brought to the tabernacle to consecrate it.
Yeah.
It's really just quite a powerful, and it happens each on over 12 consecutive days.
Yeah. And we learned about many of these offerings and sacrifices. Some of them are for sin, some of them are just to be able to come near out of thanks and appreciation. And so it's almost like, hey, we learned about this stuff already. Right. Now we're not just seeing it as an instruction, but we're seeing it as a consecration as they get ready to journey forward. So in many ways, they're preparing their hearts in every kind of way as they get ready to head out and take these steps forward.
Right. And what happens after that is, it tells us that after this consecration, that Moses goes into the tent of the meeting to speak with the Lord, which he was in the tent of meeting at the beginning of the book. It tells us that the Lord spoke to him, and he heard the voice speaking from him from above the mercy seat that was on the Ark of the Testimony, from between the 2 cherubim, and it spoke to him. And so we just get this like final image of like, it's all put together.
Yeah.
And it's functioning.
Yeah.
In a way, right?
As in Exodus, when Moses is on the mountain and he's introducing this design for this tabernacle, when he speaks of that Ark of the Covenant and mercy seat, he tells Moses, there's where I'm going to meet you.
Right.
And so we see it happening in Numbers.
Right. And imagine, like, throughout Exodus and the second half of Exodus, at least, God's presence has been this cloud on the top of a mountain that they're camping at the base at.
Yes.
And now God's presence is in the tent, in the middle of them.
Yeah.
So much closer, so much more intimate. And it's beautiful. And as we've been told in Leviticus, and as we'll be reminded in Numbers, it's also dangerous.
Yeah.
And that's really important.
Yeah. And Exodus ended that Moses couldn't go into the tabernacle. And what we discussed, what I introduced Leviticus, was that when you pick up in Numbers, God is talking to Moses from within the tabernacle. And so we established that Leviticus was the key. And that's where we get the offerings and the sacrifices. that then allow even Moses himself to then access that space. So
Mhm.
to your point, this is beautiful, but it's not a, this is not a free pass into the tabernacle for everyone. There's a means through offering sacrifice that allow that to happen. So it's beautiful, but that it could be dangerous. And we saw that with Aaron's first sons.
Right. And this section, this first section, this organization is explicitly not entirely in chronological order.
Mm,
And I meant to mention that earlier, and it'll come up again, but there are dates that are given for a few of these things, and they're not in chronological order. It's been organized in a specific manner. That manner is not necessarily chronological. So I don't know, but I almost feel somewhat when I read this that we're supposed to understand this might be the first time Moses has entered the tabernacle
hmm
since he was not able to at the end of Exodus.
Yeah,
That the census of the people was told to us before, so we understood how many people were where, and we were given the instructions. But that these offerings and the consecration of the tabernacle may have and Moses entering may have chronologically happened before.
correct. Yeah. So then you would be saying when you read, and God spoke to Moses from the tabernacle,
Mhm.
that verse 1 is now referring to this moment here.
Right.
Yeah.
So then what happens next is we've consecrated the tabernacle.
Okay.
We've given offerings and all of that. And what happens next is sort of a consecration of the Levites. They are cleansed. They give their sacrifices. The Levites are going to exist in very close proximity to this presence of the Creator being.
Yeah.
That requires a level of ritual purity
Yep.
and consecration and set apartness. It's actually, when you think about it, the primary reason why besides the fact that the Levites have a lot of duties they need to take care of, why aren't they warriors? Because the Levites can't be in the presence of death because they live in the presence of life.
Correct. Yeah. They can't be out fighting in the field and go to battle because then they'll be ceremonially unclean if they touch a dead body. And then now no one can.
7 days outside the
Yep.
camp, and they've got work to. They've got jobs, you know. They've got to, and so they're going to guard the tent as well, because as we've seen, if someone who doesn't know what they're doing or isn't supposed to be there
Yeah,
comes too close, like we saw with Aaron's sons, they could and most likely will die.
for sure.
So so to protect the people, the Levites are also set to guard the camp.
Yeah. I guess what's cool to visualize too, right? Because they're getting ready to move. And to your point, in Exodus, God is on the mountain, and
Mhm.
Moses is like the mediator in between them and this group of people. Now
Mhm.
they're an organized camp, and God has made his dwelling in their midst.
Right.
So they're not carrying their beach equipment for vacation. They're not carrying, they're carrying the presence of God.
Right.
Yeah, they're bearing God's presence with them. So I think that's a good picture to have too, right? Like
Mhm.
you got all these tribes, but they're carrying the presence of God as they journey forward.
Yeah. And we learn also God tells him that the Levites have like a set duty period for their based on their age. So they come onto duty at 25 years old, which is seems old to me to start working. And then and they'll work till the age of 50, and then they retire essentially at 50. Um, at, that's when
25 years of service.
that's when they withdraw from the duty of the service, which is like they're carrying things.
Mm,
Between that, it says that they will still minister to their brothers in the tent of meeting by keeping guard, but
yeah,
they won't work within the tent of meeting at that point.
yeah.
All right. So now we're almost ready. We're almost ready, and this is where we get to a moment of this is explicitly out of chronological order. The next thing we're given is the celebration of the Passover. So this is the first time that the Passover has been celebrated since the original Passover. So this is the first time that the actual practice has been put, the holiday has been celebrated. And this is Numbers chapter 9, if you're following along with us. Um, So they celebrate the Passover, and it tells us they do this in the first month of the second year, which is when they're supposed to do it.
Yep.
But if you were paying attention, the beginning of Numbers starts in the second month of the second year. So this is like gone a month earlier.
Mm.
And so now there's many reasons why it's been organized this way, but I think we are about to set out on our journey into the wilderness. And what was the last time that they set out on their journey into the wilderness? That was when they left Exodus, and that was hearkened by the Passover.
Yes.
So they're giving us this Passover celebration narrative right before they're going to give us this information about, tell us that they're setting out into the camp to really reinforce that idea.
Mm.
And I can see the logic of organizing it this way.
Yeah. Before you go forward, Ben, Ryan made a comment that I think would be worth commenting on.
Yeah.
He said, not sure if this was mentioned, but isn't that the same reason God didn't allow David to build him a tabernacle and instead allowed his son Solomon to? Too much blood on David's hands, I think.
I don't remember exactly what the reasoning giving was. Do you, Ezekiel?
Yeah. There's a mention of there's just so much blood on his hands.
Oh yeah.
So in many ways, let's say just blood from one death would be enough not to, let's say, enter into the sacred space. Now, obviously, there's purification that someone can go through, but I think that definitely hits at it. It's not more explicit than that, but it would make sense with what we understand.
Yeah, I think it's clear that the Levites are held to a higher purification standard than the rest of the congregation of Israel is. Sure. There are specific rules that they are not allowed to. There's certain examples of things that, like, I suppose an awkward one, but it's the one that I remember potentially because it was so awkward, is that the Levites are not allowed to marry prostitutes. Mm-hmm. The rest of the congregation, it's like if you are going to have that relationship, right? It's not going to say, well, no, a prostitute can never be married. She will always live with whatever it is. It's not that, but that the Levites, because they work in the most holy places, they need to be more set apart from all of the chaos and the death and the manipulation and the abuse that exists in the world. And actually, I think that makes a good segue to talk about what did we just see created here in the wilderness? We have this congregation of people and this larger group of people. They've been set apart. They've been chosen. Then within them is a smaller circle of specifically set apart people, including priests who will work in an even more holy center place, of which in that place, the decisions that they make will have large consequences.
Yes. God
has just turned them into Eden.
Mm.
We've just seen the restructuring of we've got Eden, which is a large circle.
Yeah,
so you can see me. We've got the garden, which is a set apart, smaller place, and then in the midst of that garden, the tree of the knowledge of good and evil.
Yeah. So, like you would be saying, you got the camp of Israel, you have the tabernacle, which would be Eden, but then you have the garden where the tree of life is, which I guess would be like the most holy place in that tabernacle. Correct?
Yeah. Well, there's even two layers of the same pattern. The tabernacle itself has an outside area, a middle area, and then a holy of holies.
Oh yeah, even the tabernacle itself, outer court.
Right. If you zoom out, then the tabernacle becomes that inner place. Yeah. The Levites become Eden, and then or the garden, and then the rest of the congregation becomes Eden.
Yeah.
And then it's outside of that camp that people who are unclean are exiled for a specific amount of time and then can re-enter. And so I think there's a lot of, when you start to see this, we're almost being given meta information about Eden itself, in the sense of, okay, so now we're seeing these priests and they work in the garden,
Yes.
in the center place. So Adam and Eve were like priests. Or
Absolutely.
the priests are like Adam and Eve. And then, and that's the important point I want to come back to, of why it's given to us the specific information that both men and women can take the Nazarite vow,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah, because you have Adam and Eve as priests.
Yeah. So now we've learned that Adam and Eve are like priests, or the priests are, in a way, they're echoing this role that Adam and Eve were in originally.
Yes.
And more than that, these laws that we get about purification, where people have to be brought outside of the camp, but only for a certain amount of time before they can be brought back in. I think that's powerful, and I think that when you think about that and look back on the story of Eden, there's things to meditate on there.
Yeah, because at the time when Adam and Eve are exiled, right, from Eden, the story leaves where they can't go back in. There's actually, right, cherubim, these spiritual creatures who are guarding, like they are the guards with this flaming sword. So Adam and Eve cannot just now waltz back into this sacred holy place. So I think what it is beautiful is that now God has provided a way for this nation of Israel to come near. I think that was powerful about the word offering. In Hebrew, it's come near. It's the come near. Bring the come near. Like, this allows you to come near, like, and access that. And then, I'll just say this: woven onto the curtains of the tabernacle were the cherubim.
And on the ark, right?
Yes, and on the ark. And so there's also 3 levels of cherubim here: the entrance to the tabernacle, the holy place, and then the veil. They're like these guards at all these degrees, and certain things and certain people can access certain spaces. So yeah, definitely the picture of this tabernacle being Eden and these priests being like Adam and Eve. It's a good thing to make a connection with.
Right. And I want everyone to just keep this in mind, of these 3 sections we have, if you will. We've got the congregation, we've got the Levites, and then we've got the center place, which only a few specific people can go into. People like Moses in the very center, and the high priest, and things like that. Yeah. Right. So just keep that in mind as we're going through the rest of this narrative. So after they celebrate the Passover like they're supposed to, and when they're supposed to, so real quick, actually, there's an important thing that happens, is that they're going to celebrate the Passover, but there's a problem. There's a few men who have touched a dead body. It doesn't tell us why. Likely they had to bury a relative. Not something, obviously, that they're not supposed to do. Yep. They're supposed to bury their relatives, but it has put them into an unclean state during the period of when they're supposed to celebrate Passover. And they're like, we can't celebrate the Passover when we're unclean, but we can't not celebrate the Passover. I mean, what does the Passover represent? Think about the conflict here. I've come in contact with death. I'm unclean. Can I now not partake in the deliverance that God has for me?
Yeah, and there's like a law you're supposed to. You can't just, you're not going to celebrate the Passover. So they kind of have 2 conflicting laws colliding.
Right.
What do they do?
Right. What do they do? So they go to Moses and they're like, hey, what do we do? And Moses is like, yeah, that seems like a problem. I'll go talk to God about it. And God said, and in short, God says, no, you definitely need to keep the Passover. Do it a month later after you've become clean.
Yeah.
And he says this for he's like, if you're unclean, if you're not around, if you're traveling at the time, right? Do it the next month. So you absolutely will do it. And it's powerful of like, no, you don't get left out of this just because you've been brushed with death, just because death is and impurity has come upon you,
Yeah. And
right? You know?
I think what's also awesome to note here, someone might say, well, God already gave the law, just do what it says,
Mm-hmm.
as if, and I think this is when we introduced this Bible study, we talked about how the Bible's not just a rule book. It's
Mm-hmm.
meant to be kind of wisdom,
Mm-hmm.
and it's supposed to generate wisdom. So in this case, you do have some instructions from God, but here comes a scenario that there was no instruction for.
Mm-hmm.
So how does it get worked out? Well, obviously they come to Moses, and then they want Moses to help them. Moses goes to God, and so now God gives them, you could say, further instruction. But what I think it is showing is that now, okay, we have these two instructions. What do we do? Because they seem like they're colliding. Let's just use wisdom here. And God says, okay, you do keep the Sabbath, but you just do it a month later.
Mm-hmm.
It's almost like you had to work that wisdom out, right? Not saying God had to work it out, but you see this, okay, wisdom being applied to the situation here.
Right,
And
and
then,
and it's still open ended, but
yeah,
he's given them now the means by which to reason solutions for themselves. I mean,
yeah,
and this is a small example. We'll actually see a similar situation come up later, but like, well, what if I'm unclean in the second month too? Then
yeah,
you go to the third month. I mean, God didn't say that, but that's the wisdom.
that's the wisdom. Yeah, and this is powerful for Bible for like where we like I just wish there was a verse for that. And sometimes there's not. They
Sometimes.
didn't have a law for that at the moment or
Mhm,
instruction. What do? We use wisdom.
mhm.
And I think that's powerful.
Right, because what is the right thing to do is circumstantial.
Yeah.
And so you'll see even later, God's going to give them new laws that will be laws for when they're in the promised land because they will be now a new circumstance.
Yeah.
And
So it's like
so,
it's just like new wisdom coming for a new circumstance.
right, and so if you read the Bible, you don't get this sense of oh, we're just all of these laws are just written down because we're supposed to just follow them.
Yeah.
It's clear that we're being given instruction that is wisdom in that circumstance, and from that we can gain insight on wisdom to apply to our own circumstance,
Yes. Yeah.
even if that's a wildly different circumstance, as is the case with us most of the time.
Yeah. Yeah.
And indeed, if a biblical author was just attempting to write a scroll that just was like, hey, here's the laws, follow them. What you would expect was a scroll that just had the laws categorized in a way that they were easy to look up and reference if you were in a legal dispute, like, hey, what am I supposed to do in this situation? And you don't find that anywhere.
Yeah.
What you find are laws which have been given in the context of the narrative around them so that you can understand them and you can gain insight into the wisdom of God.
Yeah.
That's the gift.
Yep.
And I don't want to go on too much of a tangent on it, but I had the privilege of actually attending a service at a Jewish synagogue once while I was in college, and I remember being blown away at the time by how much they spoke. Like the Ten Commandments were proudly displayed
Mm.
on the wall in a plaque, and it was all a gift to them.
Yep.
And I always thought of these rules as being these like, oh, they're rules, they're holding me back. God just doesn't want me to have any fun,
Yep.
right? All those kinds of things. But to them, they're gifts. And I've started to understand why, because all of those times that I say, man, God, I wish I had wisdom. I wish I understood what the right thing was to do.
Yeah.
We've been given wisdom that we can start to try to understand.
Yep.
Because what God wants is us to have the maturity to be able to discern through his wisdom,
Yep.
Good judgment.
Yeah. I would just kind of like to just wrap this little,
Yeah.
but it's some people, I think we do two extremes with like Old Testament stuff. Let's just use Leviticus for example.
Mhm.
Oh, none of that stuff applies to me. I can't translate that. So it's not important.
Right.
Just leave it out, skip over it. Then the other extreme is, no, this is God's word and his law, so we have to do all of it. And I think both are definitely missing the intention.
Mhm. Yeah.
Yes, there's actual law for them because it's within the context of their setting. So an instruction about your ox goring your neighbor, how we make restitution for this. That's very applicable, but there's a wisdom for that. Like that's a real thing that happens, but there's real wisdom in there.
Right.
And now that you can't just translate that. None of us have ox, like so does it mean we just throw out the verse? There's no wisdom in it? No, there's actually wisdom in there. It's talking about something that you have now harming your neighbor. Let's make restitution. That's the wisdom there.
Right. Yeah, and when we live in a context that's so wildly different. I mean, I remember saying it at this point in time, their most complicated structure right now is a large tent in the center of all of them. A tent.
Yeah.
How could we apply this to our judicial system when we have buildings and infrastructure and things like jail and prison, right? It's incomparable as just a direct thing. When people ask, I've had a friend ask, like, how do you figure out like what laws apply and what laws don't anymore? Because there's laws that are like, don't sleep with your neighbor's wife. That seems like that applies, doesn't it still? And what I've come to understand is none of them apply, and they all apply at the same time.
Yeah.
The wisdom applies. Yes. It just so happens that the wisdom behind not sleeping with your neighbor's wife at that time still applies today in very much the same way. Yeah. But it's not because that law exists in the Old Testament that you follow it. It's because, especially we as Christians, because we've been developed to understand that that's not a loving thing to do to your neighbor or to his wife necessarily,
No matter the historical date on the calendar. There's
right, exactly.
Wisdom that transcends that.
So, moving forward, they've celebrated the Passover. They've resolved this little sort of conflict in the law. And then we're told that the cloud covers the tabernacle, and we're told that the cloud will now guide them. So that the cloud is going to, it says it appears as a cloud during the day and like fire at night. And it goes before them. And when it goes out, they pick up camp and they go out like God instructed them to, everyone in the order. And then when it stops, they stop and they set up camp.
Just like in Exodus, right? We see that when they're coming out of Egypt, there's God's presence is a pillar of fire by day, a cloud by night. And so one of the things we mentioned just here that Leviticus was kind of the centerpiece, but Exodus and Numbers have a lot of similarities, just like Genesis and Deuteronomy will have. So we're pulling on a lot of themes of Exodus.
Mm-hmm. And then, and so then the next thing that happens is we get one last little instruction. It's like, hey, by the way, one last organization thing, make some trumpets out of silver. They make silver trumpets, and then they will blow the trumpets because it's a huge camp. It's like, wait, how do you tell who to go when? Like everyone's going to start bumping into each other. So they have a series of like signals that they can blow of like, okay, now Judah sets out. And then everyone will follow them. So it's organized, and alarms that they can sound for if they're going, if someone's going to attack you. So hey, because if you're in a group this big, someone in the front could be like, there's an army coming towards us, and you're in the back and you can't see that, and you think it's just a beautiful day.
Yep.
Right. So the trumpets will be like, hey, we're under attack, and so everyone, take your positions and things like that. So God gives them those instructions. The last little sort of practical infrastructure thing, and then they set out for the first time, and we're told that they all set out in the exact way in which they were told to set out. And we get this last line of chapter 10 where it says, whenever the ark set out, Moses said, arise, O Yahweh, and let your enemies be scattered, and let those who hate you flee before you. Mm-hmm. And when it rested, he said, return, O Yahweh, to the 10,000 thousands of Israel. Mm-hmm. And that's how this book moves into, now we were in the wilderness at Sinai. Now we're traveling through the wilderness. So now we've created Eden, and now Eden's on the move.
Yep. So
that's mobile Eden.
Yep. Eden's on the move. So now, I guess when you're reading and you get now you're crossing into chapter 11, now you're getting into this traveling through. So
right now
where we're at.
Right now we're in a traveling phase, and it's like, great, we've got mobile Eden. God set us up. We're organized. We're great. It's going to be great. Everything's going to be great, right? the first line of chapter 11, and the people complained in the hearing of Yahweh about their misfortunes. And when Yahweh heard it, his anger was kindled, and the fire of Yahweh burned among them and consumed some outlying parts of the camp. So immediately, at least in narrative time, this hasn't gone off to a great start. And this is going to come up various times. So I'll address that now, and that's we're gonna knock on each one a little bit here, where there's a complaint or a rebellion of some kind that happens by the people, and there'll be a fairly consistent pattern in which the people are going to complain or rebel. God will desire to unleash a complete punishment upon the people. Moses will intercede on their behalf. And that punishment will be that judgment will be focused, and then mercy will be given to the rest.
And those are themes, right? Judgment, right. Mercy.
That we've heard, judgment and mercy, and all of that. And a lot of these, you'll actually, if you remember from Exodus, these should sound very familiar. One of the first things that happens is that they have a strong craving for meat.
Yep.
And a lot of this phrasing actually echoes from Exodus when they're hungry and God provides manna. What we learn here is that they're still living on manna. Yes. Like it's been a year and they've been eating just this manna, which I suppose anyone would get tired of the same food, even really good food, after a year. But they even go so far as to say, man, the food was good in Egypt. We ate for nothing. They said that it cost nothing. Except, of course, their slave labor, but they seem to have forgotten that.
Yeah.
And they seem to have forgotten that they were delivered from that.
Yes.
And so what's interesting is that, well, here, we'll get to that. Moses is very annoyed at them to the point where he's like, God, he says, kill me at once if I have found favor in your sight, that I may not see my wretchedness. Moses is already, it's the beginning of this trip. I don't know if anyone's ever been like, especially like in a family road trip, and the beginning of the road trip, you've got everything in the car, everything's packed nicely, and then it starts off and the kids are already complaining and the parents are like, I'm not doing this the whole trip.
Yeah. Like, are we there yet? Did you just started 5 minutes?
You just left the neighborhood. Are we there yet? And especially as a parent, if you're going, like, say you're taking your kids to a special vacation at Disney World and they're already complaining about the trip.
Yeah.
Right? That doesn't.
Yeah. Like, I'm hungry. At home, we have this. It's like, wait, you're headed to Disneyland and you're.
Right. But so Moses is already tired. So God appoints elders to aid Moses. And we get a story where God tells Moses to bring 70 of the elders of Israel and bring them to the tent of meeting, and he'll give his spirit to those men so that they can share your authority and your burden. We learn that when they do so, they start prophesying, and then they stop. It specifically tells us that they stop doing so. And we also get this note that there's 2 men in the camp who weren't present that started prophesying, so that the Lord's spirit also went upon these other 2 guys, which hadn't been gathered there. And a boy named Caleb, who I believe it's Caleb. No, sorry, I apologize. It's Joseph. It's Joshua. Joshua's like, hey, go stop them. They're not. This isn't the order, right? They were supposed to be here. And Moses says, I wish that the Lord's spirit would be on everyone. He's essentially like, Joshua, that's a good problem to have.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
More men with God's spirit. Thank the Lord.
Yeah.
Right.
Yep.
And then, so that was interrupting this sort of story of the people complaining about wanting meat. And so what we learn is that the Lord springs up a bunch of quail come up on, and they all die, and the people are like, oh, great, we have a bunch of meat. And then a plague comes through the quail and kills many of these people who had this craving.
Yeah.
Then what happens next is, like, if you thought the story might get better and maybe the people have learned their lesson, what happens next is that Moses' siblings, his sister Miriam and Aaron, and his brother Aaron, who's the high priest, actually speak against Moses. They're angry about a woman he's married, and they're like, you know what? Like, has God only spoken through Moses? Like, maybe we don't need Moses. Essentially, maybe we have favor with God too.
His spirit could be on us too.
Right, exactly. And then so God addresses them and he essentially comes to speak against this issue. He's like, you guys should realize that Moses, like, he says this to them. He says, if there is a prophet among you, I, Yahweh, make myself known to him in a vision or speak to him in a dream, but not with Moses. Yeah. He is faithful in all my house. I speak mouth to mouth clearly and not in riddles. He beholds the form of Yahweh. Why are you not afraid to speak against him?
Wow.
So he's saying, like, look, Moses is in close relationship to me, and if you're going to speak against Moses, you're speaking against me. And then we learn, and so so he's like, and if you're speaking against me, that's like, we're in a covenant relationship. I'm your God, right? I apologize, the chaoticness of this. I need to step back for a moment, back to the last chapter, because I forgot. This is, actually one of the things that's going on is, so when the people complained about food in Exodus, they were given bread. They were given this manna. They're now complaining about the manna, and instead of just simply providing, there's a plague that comes upon them, and they're like, not only does that feel severe, but it's not the same. This seems like the same thing that they did before in Exodus. Mm-hmm. They complained about food.
Yeah.
But now you're punishing them at least more so than you did before. What's up with that? What's changed? Yeah. And we're going to see this a few times where there's something that's almost the same as it was in Exodus, that the people do almost the same thing that they had done in Exodus. Mm-hmm. But that the punishment is greater, or when there wasn't a direct punishment before, there is now.
Yeah.
And so if you sit there and be like, well, something must have changed. What's changed? You see, the very important thing that's changed is, before they had gotten to Mount Sinai, they had been delivered, but they had not entered into a covenant relationship with God. They weren't married yet, so to speak.
Now
right? They've now gone through the ceremony. They've made their vows. And so now they're the covenant people, and they're held to a higher standard.
Yes.
And so that's really important to remember, that these are people who have said, we will do everything that you tell us to do. We will be your people.
Yes.
We will follow these. And they've already massively messed up once with the golden calf. All right. So back to the story of Miriam and Aaron real quick, just to round that out.
Yeah.
So he's like, hey, you speak against Moses, you're speaking against me. And it says the cloud removes from the tent, and Miriam is leprous afterwards.
Wow.
Now, I think it's easy to ask, well, like, wait, Aaron was there too. Why didn't Aaron get leprous? Did he not deserve it? Is it like, well, he's favoring Aaron because he's a man,
yeah.
Right? But it's important to remember that despite what he's done, Aaron's the high priest. Just as we spoke before, they're kept to higher standards of cleanliness. If Aaron was to become leprous, that would be a much bigger issue than Miriam becoming leprous. Miriam can what she does is follow the rules. She goes out of the camp until she's clean again and comes back in. Aaron can't do that. He's the high priest. And so I think that's likely the reason that we don't see this punishment carried out on Aaron as well.
Yeah.
Moving again forward, we get into one of the biggest and potentially most important turning points of this narrative. Because It's been a bit of a mess, but we're still moving towards the promised land, and it's still great.
You're still headed.
Now what's going to happen is God is going to command them to send spies out into the promised land. At this point in time, for reference, I don't have a map for you at the moment, but they're about halfway. When based on the locations and where we think these locations are, they're about halfway to the promised land. And the Lord tells them to send 12 people, one from each tribe, a spy out into the land of Canaan, into the promised land. Now, these 12 people aren't following the cloud. They aren't camping. They aren't 600,000 like men, fighting men, millions of people traveling. So they're going to get there much quicker. And we learn they spend 40 days. They go and they come back, and it's 40 days. Now, we are given flashes of vocabulary that should really remind us of things. So when Moses sends them to spy out, he tells them to, go up into the hill country, see what the land is, whether the people who dwell in it are strong or weak, or few or many, whether the land that they dwell in it is good or bad, whether the cities they dwell in are camps or strongholds, whether the land is rich or poor, and whether there are trees in it or not. Be of good courage. Bring some fruit of that land back with you. And so if you start saying, hey, these are terms that I remember hearing,
yep,
then you're being very attentive. So that they're going to go and they're going to see whether or not this is good or bad. And we know God's told them to send spies, but we aren't told what purpose God had in mind for the spies, only what Moses tells them to do. Mm-hmm. So they go and they spy the land, and they see the descendants of Enoch there, and that will come up later. Mm-hmm. And they brought a branch, a cluster of grapes that was so big they had to carry it on a pole between two men. And they also carried pomegranates and figs. So all this stuff should really start jumping out to us of like, mm-hmm. they're taking fruit out of the land, and it mentions figs. Remember figs? Figs were in the garden.
Yep.
Adam and Eve used their leaves to color themselves after they took the fruit.
That's right.
So it's these flashes of like this Eden imagery of specifically surrounding the fall. And so it's these flashes that aren't setting us up to expect good things of what might happen next. And so the spies come back. At the end of the 40 days, they returned from spying out the land. And they came to the congregation and Aaron and Moses, and they said, it flows with milk and honey, which is a way of saying it's rich in both wild and cultivated resources. Milk comes from livestock, so that's an organized human thing. But honey comes from the wild. They're not at this point in this culture farming bees.
Yeah.
Only something you go out and you find in the wild. So it's flowing with milk and honey is to say it's abundant in all of the ways that it could be. And this is its fruit. They've brought its fruit, right? But then they say, however, the people in the land are strong and the cities are big and fortified. And besides, we saw the descendants of Enoch there. And the Amalekites dwell in that land. The Amalekites were those who attacked them on their way out of Egypt. And then there's various other groups of people. Remember the Ites, Hittites, Jebusites, Amorites, right? Amalekites. Mm-hmm. But we learned that Caleb, who was one of the spies that was sent out, he's like, don't worry about it. Right, let us go up at once and occupy it. We'll be able to overcome it. He knows that the Lord's with them. He promised the land. But they were like, no, we can't fight it. They're stronger than we are. Yeah. And so they bring a bad report to the people of Israel, saying that the land devours its inhabitants, and that the people we saw in there are great of heights. We saw the Nephilim. You remember the Nephilim from Genesis? There's giants there. We seemed like grasshoppers to them. Yeah. There's giants in this land. We don't want to go mess with them. We don't want to pick that fight. And so they're afraid. And so what happens next in chapter 14? The congregation freak out.
The bad report spreads.
Right. The bad report spreads. The people freaked out and they grumble against Moses and Aaron. And look at what they said. They say, would we have died in the land of Egypt or have died in the wilderness?
Mm.
Why is Yahweh bringing us into this land just to be killed? Our wives and our children, they'll become prey. Would it not be better for us to go back to Egypt? Yeah. And then they said to one another, let us choose a leader and go back to Egypt. And Moses and Aaron try to stop them, and Joshua and Caleb, who were the two spies who didn't agree and were saying, hey, no, it's going to be great. They're like, the land's great. It's good land. And if Yahweh delights in us, he will bring us into it.
Yeah.
Do not rebel against Yahweh. Do not fear the people of the land. They are bread for us. So, right, they said, oh, the land's going to devour us. They're saying, no, we're going to devour the land. We'll devour the people that are in it, right? They're going to be bread for us. The Lord is with us. Do not fear them. But then the congregation is like, they're going to stone them. Moses, Aaron, Caleb, Joshua. So they're going to stone these leaders, the people that brought them out of Egypt. They're going to rebel against the God that brought them out of Egypt. They're going to choose for them a new leader. They're going to go back to Egypt in their slavery. Yeah. They rejected the promised land. They rejected their God. They're going to kill the leaders that God has given them, and they're going to go back.
Yeah, what just came into my mind was the whole picture diagram of the camp, how you got all these chapters of God setting this up, organizing them, this plan. They're going to go forward. This is the land we're going to. And in this chapter shows, no, we're going to choose our own wisdom. They fail. They fail at the fruit tree once again. They mistrust Yahweh and his instruction. And now look at their plan to go back against God's plan to go forward. His organization versus theirs. New leaders, we're going back. Wow.
Right. They're gonna take out the leaders. They're gonna entirely break down the setup of the camp that we've seen. The whole outside area has now positioned itself as the center of it, and we'll decide our leaders, and we'll decide what we're gonna do, instead of this cloud, instead of Yahweh, instead of these priests. Right.
Wow. Everything just crumbled.
Right. And so this is, and this is, they want a divorce.
Yeah.
And they want to do it violently.
Yep.
And so understandably, Yahweh is very angry at them for this.
Yeah. They don't want the place that God has for them. They don't want Moses, who was the first representative before them. They don't want Aaron, who God has appointed through Moses. Mm-hmm. They don't want. Yeah. So this is severe.
Right. This is a full rebellion against the Creator God who delivered them out of their slavery. Yeah. And entered into a covenant contract with them. So not only would it be wrong to like treat someone who did all that for you wrong, but then to enter an official like legal contract with them that you now want to break. Yeah. It's with a God who's a God of justice. Yeah. Right? And that's what this important. So this is a God of justice. What is he going to do with these people? They've broken covenant contract with him. They want to kill the people that he's established. They want to upset everything he's done. Okay. What is he going to do? Well, the just thing, which he says first, what he says to Moses is like, I will strike them with pestilence and disinherit them, and I will make you a nation greater and mightier than they are. Essentially, Moses, we can start over with you. We can make them Mosesites.
Yeah, and we saw this in Exodus again. So these books are paralleling. There's these parallels, but you might like, oh, it's just repeating itself again. But they're different people, but they're committing the same, right? These same mistakes. They're turning into serpents. These people.
Mm-hmm. But what Moses says is he says essentially, well, one, what are the Egyptians going to think if you kill all of them? Everyone knows that you're in the midst of them. They're going to think you just brought them out to kill them. And then he says, now please let the power of the Lord be great as you have promised, saying, Yahweh is slow to anger and abounding in steadfast love, forgiving iniquity and transgression. He will by no means clear the guilty, visiting the iniquity of the fathers on the children to the third and fourth generation. Please pardon the iniquity of this people according to the greatness of your steadfast love, just as you have forgiven this people from Egypt until now. So Moses says, God, I know you're a God of justice, but you're also a God of mercy and love.
Yep. So we see those themes, right?
Mm-hmm. And this is important, right? And we've seen this happen before, and it will happen again, where we see this tension between God's justice and his mercy, between his just anger and his steadfast love for these people. So God says, I have pardoned according to your word. So he accepts Moses' proposal. He's like, I will be the God of mercy.
Yeah.
But I am still the God of justice. So there will be punishment. They didn't want to go into the promised land. They won't. And see that too. The justice here is that he gives them what they wanted. He won't bring them back to Egypt because he loves them and he knows that's going to be terrible for them. And he made a promise to them. But if they didn't want to go into the promised land, then fine, we won't. And that's the major justice. And and what he says is those children that you said would become prey in that land, I'll bring them into the promised land.
Yeah. So justice and mercy are both happening.
Mm-hmm.
Pastor Tanya asked a good question. Do you think it was God's spirit still interceding through Moses for the people? Ben?
I think that it can, in a way, yes. I mean, we're certainly seeing, I think what we're seeing is though it's Moses speaking, we're being brought of this tension that is within God himself, in a way, within his complex nature of this tension between his justice and his love. And so to say that it's God's spirit that's interceding through Moses, I think we've been shown this closeness so much, established this closeness that Moses has with God, such that we do understand that Moses isn't speaking as a completely separate entity from God, as if he's this separate thing which is calming God down. He is close with God. He is in close relationship with God. He has God's spirit on him. And so Moses interceding is, I think correctly to state, is also God interceding
through Moses.
Through Moses, right? And it's bringing human. Yeah, you can go.
Sorry, go ahead. No, finish your thought.
Okay, it's bringing human beings into, like, what we're seeing here is in Genesis we saw that humans were meant to rule, and what would that look like? Well, here we're seeing that Moses has this influence, you could call it, there's two natures of God. There's the nature of justice and there's the nature of love. And Moses, and so there's two ways this can go down, essentially.
Yep.
There's the easy way, there's the mercy way, there's the hard way, right? There's plan B. We're being told there's plan B. God can fulfill his promise technically through Moses. He could get rid of all the people and he could make Moses into a nation and bring them into the promised land.
Yeah.
But Moses says, we're going to go the mercy route. We're going to go the love route.
Yep.
And God says, okay.
Yeah. I think Moses just becomes the human picture to show us God, because Moses is not telling God, hey, God, you should do this. You should just go this way, even though you can only go that way. He's appealing to who God is already. He's like, you are a merciful God. So it's not so much like God forgot, but I think Moses is just becoming the character for us to see on the outside who's appealing to all of God's nature and just showing us, look, this really, really is upsetting to God. Mm-hmm. But now look at, like, and so you almost see like God on one side, but then Moses is just going to appeal to who God also is. Right. And you're also merciful. And then here comes God and
It's so important to realize that what Moses' argument is, hey, God, it's in your nature to be merciful and loving, right? It's not, Moses isn't fighting God's nature, that God is naturally this angry being and he has to be convinced. Moses is appealing to God to be who God is, right? And it's so good. It's so fascinating.
Don't worry, guys. We will finish 9:33. We will finish.
So, so we see though that there will be judgment acted. So all of the people, for the most part, they were convinced by these spies to be afraid of the land. They didn't get to see it themselves. So God's like, okay, you know what? You don't want to go into the land. We won't. I'll bring your children into the land, and we're gonna spend 40 years in the wilderness until this generation has passed away. Mm-hmm. For the spies, the 10 spies that saw the land but didn't trust God, they are struck with a plague and killed. Mm. So we do see that there's focused punishment that is brought to the instigators of this rebellion. Yeah. And then an overarching but more merciful judgment that's brought, which is essentially giving them what they want. Yes. So it's like, okay, well, that was a mess, but there's hope, and maybe now they get it, right? Maybe now they can trust God. But then all of the people of Israel are like, wait, never mind, God, you're right, we sinned, we're sorry, let's go into the promised land. And Moses is like, no, that's not how this works. You're just going to be rebelling against God again by doing that, because he's now said that you won't. And they're like, no, it'll be fine. It's good. We know that we're wrong. We know that we sinned. Notably, they say that they know they've sinned, but have not put into practice any of the laws which God gave them to do when they realize they've sinned.
Yeah, a burnt offering or a sin offering or both should be coming up now.
None of that's happened. But they're like, oh, yeah, no, we know we sinned. We'll go into the promised land. Moses is like, that's a bad idea. God's not with you. And what happens? They go out, and they're the Amalekites and the Canaanites who live there, they defeated and pursued them. So now we've seen that there's just consequences of the rebellion that weren't even directly enacted by God. They've decided to stray away from his protection, and they were defeated, and we don't know how many were killed. It doesn't tell us here. Now, remember all of those laws that I told you about that they weren't following about the sins? Well, it just so happens that the very next section, we get these things. God's telling Moses the laws of these sacrifices and of an unintentional sins and what to do after them. Yeah. And it's like, and we know a lot of these have been given to us before. They're in ways repetition. It's pretty clear to me, at least, why these are suddenly given. It's like, hey, remember all this stuff you should have done? Yeah. Here it is. Yeah. Right?
Yeah, God's provided a means of how to be reconciled back to him when you sin, intentionally or unintentionally. So there is a way to then come near unto God. There's a proper way to come near in sin.
Right. If they truly realized that they had sinned, here's the stuff that they should have done, that they should have known that they could do to be brought back into a pure and right relationship with God after that. But instead, they essentially choose to just rebel against him again. Yeah. And so at the end, and just to make it clear about what the section's about, at the end of chapter 15, the Lord gives a new law, which says, he says, tell the people to make tassels on the corners of their garments, put a cord of blue in the tassel of each corner, which could be significant because it was a cloth of blue that's put over all of the things in the tabernacle when they're going to be traveling. And the tassel will be for you to look at and remember all the commandments of the Lord. See what he says, to remember the commandments of the Lord, to do them, not to follow after your own heart and your own eyes, which you are inclined to whore after. So you shall remember and do all my commandments and be holy to your God. I am Yahweh your God, who brought you out of the land of Egypt to be your God. I am Yahweh your God. It's a very, he's like, You guys need to remember who you are, and you got to remember who I am.
Yeah.
Right? I'm Yahweh, your God, and you're my people. So remember, one, who it is that you're in a relationship with. You should fear me more than you should fear those giants out there. But two, you're my people. I promise to protect you, to bring you into this promised land, and I've shown you all of my signs, and I've taken care of you thus far. Right? Yeah. It's a big reminder. So do they get it? Well, no. In fact, it gets worse, you could say, because the next thing happens is that a man named Korah, who we are told is the son of Izhar, the son of Kohath. Oh, Kohath.
Oh, that's right. One of those Levites.
Levi. He's a Levite. And then also a man named Dathan, who's from Reuben, a Reubenite. Yeah. They rose before Moses. They rose up before Moses. Ooh, that should flash us in Eden when Cain rose up against his brother. Yeah. They rose up before Moses with a number of people in Israel, 250 well-known men, and assembled before Moses and Aaron. And they say, "You've gone too far, Moses and Aaron."
Wow.
All your congregation are holy, every one of them. Yahweh is among them. Why do you exalt yourselves? And essentially Moses says, "No, you've gone too far." So we now have Levites. So notice this. We've now had a rebellion of the congregation, of that outer circle. Now we're getting a rebellion from within that next circle. Yeah. So this is even more severe. They're held to a even higher standard than the people outside. So this is dangerous. And what Moses says is they're essentially like, "Hey, we can do this, right? We should be able to have your position in your place." And Moses is like, "You're Levites. You've already been exalted to a higher place." Mm-hmm. One. Yeah. And he says,
been set apart more.
Right. And he essentially says, "We'll let God show you who is who," right? And they all assemble before the Lord. And again, we see the Lord come, and he tells Moses and Aaron, "Move away from this congregation of people." At this point, the whole sort of congregation of Israel is gathered, including these rebels. He's like, "Move away so that I can take care of this," essentially. And Moses tells God, "No, not all of these people are rebelling. Only some of them are rebelling." Yeah. And so I'm making a long story short. But what essentially will happen is that Moses will command everyone to move away from the people who are rebels. Okay. And then the ground opens up beneath the rebels and their tents and their families, and it swallows them up. Yeah. And then closes back over them. Really crazy story. That's hard to even imagine. And then what happens after that? The people grumble against Moses and Aaron. They've just seen the ground open up and swallow rebels, and they're like, "Oh man, we're going to keep grumbling against God," right? So now we're moving into chapter 17. Wait, I might have missed something here. Oh, right. So now so the people have just seen the sign from God. They've just seen the ground open up and swallow rebels, and they're still choosing to speak out against Moses, about Aaron, against and as we've seen before in the section when Aaron and Miriam came against Moses, God considers that to be against himself.
Yep. Because God has set Moses apart.
Right. So now what are we to expect? Now there's another plague coming for the people. Yeah. And Moses tells Aaron to go get his censer and to go out and to the term is atonement, make atonement for the people with his censer. And when he comes out with his censer, people have already started dying. There's a wave of people that are dying. And Aaron runs ahead of the wave and atones for the people that are still alive. And the plague stops.
Yeah. And the
And so,
word atonement is where we get like to cover over. So yeah, whatever God tells Aaron to do with that censer, it's providing a covering, like kind of like how the angels spared, or
right.
the blood made atonement, covered them in over in Egypt.
And so we're seeing a very intense depiction of, again, that same tension of the the justice, and then also this necessity of people working on behalf of God at the same time, who are making atonement for and stopping these plagues. So after this, God has to specify, hey, Aaron is a chosen one, and there's a story of all the leaders' staffs are taken, they have their names on them, and Aaron's staff buds to show that God has appointed him as like, hey, if you didn't get it, I did appoint this guy. Then we get more information given about the duties of the Levites. So we're sort of getting these laws. We get laws for purification, right? That's after all of this stuff. It's like, hey, remember, here's how purification works.
And I could imagine that, because with all these people dying, they have to touch dead bodies to get them out the camp. They're gonna have to remember the purity laws as well.
So we've now had we've now had rebellions from the congregation. We've had rebellions from the Levites. Now, so here's what's so important about what's going to happen next. All right. The people, again, they're running out of water, and they gather themselves against Aaron and against Moses, and they quarrel with Moses, and they're like, hey, we need water. This echoes back to something that happened in Exodus. In Exodus, they needed water, and then they grumble against Moses. Moses goes to God. God says, go strike this rock, and water will come out of it. And Moses does that. He goes and he strikes the rock, and then water comes out of it, and everyone drinks. In this story, there's a difference. God tells Moses to speak to the rock, and then it will pour water out. But what happens is that what Moses does is he gathers the assembly before the rock, Moses and Aaron, and he says to them, "Hear now, you rebels, shall we bring water out of this rock for you?" It's an interesting comment from Moses. And then he lifts up his hand and strikes the rock twice. And we do see that water comes out and the congregation drinks. So we're like, wait, well, that wasn't really what he was told to do, but it seems to have worked. But Yahweh says, because you did not believe me to uphold me as holy in the eyes of the people of Israel, you shall not bring this assembly into the land that I've given them. So now Moses will not enter the promised land either. So it seems like, well, this is a little thing. He hit the rock, doesn't have feelings, instead of speaking to it. And now Moses can't enter the promised land either. Well, now we've seen this final rebellion of the most inner section of this congregation. We've seen the larger group rebel, we've seen the Levites, and now we've seen Moses, the dude. He's now rebelling against God. He's almost being depicted as on edge here with the people. And so while it's this little thing, he's a big image. He's so close to Yahweh. And so the consequences are not the same.
Yeah.
If he's not upholding, God is holy in the sense that if God says, speak to the rock and it'll do it, and he's like, well, I struck it before, I can struck it again. It can't be that important. It's what God, right? So there's these greater consequences, and we've now seen a rebellion of this very centerpiece. The last most Moses, who was the best of them all.
Mm-hmm.
Then what happens is, so we see that Miriam dies, Aaron passes away as well, and there's a series of, they have to fight with various people around them. They're getting close to the promised land now. They're a large group of people. Where they're headed seems pretty clear, and the people in that land don't like what they're seeing. And so they start coming out and attacking them, but they win. They win these battles against them. Mm-hmm. And then this climaxes with a story about a king named Balak, who is like, they've been defeating people after people, and it's a problem. So he hires a priest named Balaam to come curse the people of Israel. But 3 times when Balaam is supposed to curse them, he can only bless the people of Israel. Mm-hmm. And then the 4th and final time, he prophesies over Israel.
Yeah.
And they're really powerful poems that I suggest you read. We don't have time to get through them. I don't want to keep everyone up too late. So I won't read them to everyone. But so we have this priest who tries to curse them, but then can only bless them. And the people aren't even aware this is happening. They're up on a mountain overlooking. He's trying, and they're not even aware that God is protecting them at that very moment. That despite all of the chaos that's going on, Yahweh's up there defending them against a spiritual attack, essentially. And then what happens next? Potentially one of the lowest moments is we learn that the people, it says here at the beginning of chapter 25, when Israel lived in Shittim, the people began to whore with the daughters of Moab. So we've seen this term before too here. It's like sexual immorality here, but before God uses the same Hebrew word to refer to them looking after, deciding what was good in their own eyes. Like, whose wisdom, that theme.
Yep.
It says they invited the people to sacrifices for their gods. The people ate and bowed down to those gods. And it says Israel yoked it. This is verse 3. Israel yoked himself to Baal of Peor.
Wow.
And it's so it doesn't say the Israelites. The way it says Israel himself, like it's speaking of an individual person.
Yeah.
Yoking himself to Baal. Why? Because it's another marriage.
Yeah.
These people who are in a covenant relationship with Yahweh have now entered into a relationship with another God. Right?
Mm-hmm.
And so this severe rebellion has severe consequences.
Yes.
And we see that this climaxes to such a point that we're told that an Israelite man from the tribe of Simon brings a Midianite woman who we'll learn this man, it tells us later, this man is the son of a chief of the tribe of Simon, and a Midianite woman who's a daughter of a priest, a high priest in Midian. They go into the tabernacle before Moses and imply to potentially start doing something sexual in the tabernacle. And this sparks the anger. We would expect to see the anger of Yahweh, and we will hear that this, of course, angers him. But we see as this angers Phinehas, who's the son of Eleazar, who's the son of Aaron. And now that Aaron has passed away, Eleazar is now the high priest. Phinehas is one of the priests. So one, he's qualified to be able to go into the tabernacle, and he does, but he goes in there with a spear to kill those 2 people.
Yeah.
And we see that the Lord actually views this as it turned his anger away from the people of Israel. That Phinehas carried out the judgment.
Yeah.
A focused judgment.
Yeah.
Very, very intense stuff. And I'm going to come back to this on a high level at the end. And I want to just make sure we get through to the end of this. Because that's a very dramatic sort of end to the traveling section. And what we'll see now is not so much travel as it is they're now going to be preparing to enter the promised land. And that starts with a new census because it's a new generation. 40 years have passed.
Yeah, just the fact that you said now they're preparing to enter into the promised land speaks volumes to some mercy.
Right. Like these people, like this is the new generation that's doing this stuff.
Yeah.
So a new census is taken. And you can refer back to the if you took a screenshot, even here, I can just bring it back up. What the numbers are, and there's actually less people, and I guess we shouldn't be surprised after everything that's happened, the judgments that have been carried out. But it's a miracle there's still as many people as there is.
Yeah.
Then we get very encapsulated narrative. So we get this story where the daughters of Zelophehad. So when they go into the promised land, everyone's going to inherit land, but it's a patriarchal society. So the men are the ones that inherit the land.
Yeah.
Well, there's a problem. These daughters, they don't have a brother. Their father had no sons, and their father died in the wilderness with the generation that died away. And so essentially they're like, does that mean that our father's inheritance just disappears?
Yeah.
Right? Because there's no sons for it to carry on to. And they go to Moses about this. This is another situation where we're like, hey, there's a potential gap in the law. What do we do? Moses says, yeah, that's an issue. Let me go talk to God about it. And God says, the daughters are right. And essentially says to give them the inheritance. And as a future statute, if this situation arises again, it will go on to the daughters before it goes on to like uncles or something like that.
Wow.
Really important for many reasons. We then learn that Joshua will, because Moses can't go into the promised land, Joshua, who's now an adult, we saw him when he was younger, Joshua will now be taking over as sort of the leader, if you will, the guide, the mediator. We get more laws about the various offerings that we were told about, offerings that they seem to keep forgetting.
Right.
And then they are reminded of the festivals that they are supposed to keep. We get laws about vows, and then Midian, who were the people that when they bound themselves to Peor, they are instructed to essentially wage war against Midian, which I wish we had time to get more into. But another intense a narrative of judgment that's now being carried out through the people of Israel on this other people group.
Yeah.
So it's really been brought into, we had the center, we had the circle around the center, the bigger circle, and now it's even like you see, like we're addressing the rebellion of the nations outside that circle.
Yeah.
So it's really just painting a picture of all of these sections in the complete level of like judgment that has, and the problems that have to be dealt with.
Yeah.
We are told that, so they're going to cross into the promised land and every tribe is going to get land. But after they've defeated some of these people, there's some really great land on this side of the Jordan. And so the tribes of Reuben and Gad are like, hey, can we stay in this land? Because we kind of like it. And we've got a lot of livestock and there's a lot of space here. And Moses is like, well, but you got to help us take over the promised land. And they're like, oh, we will. We'll just come back here when we're done. And Moses is like, okay, fine. That sounds... I'm making long story short.
We don't have much time, but yep.
Right. We get a full recounting of everywhere they go, of all of the locations they hit in chapter 33. God lays out the boundaries of the land and lists out the tribal chiefs. So we've got it's ordering again.
Yes.
Like, hey, you're going to be going into the promised land. Here's the order. Here's the boundaries of the land. Here are the tribal chiefs. Here who gets what land. Here's the laws you need to keep in mind now that you're going into the land. Cities of refuge for the Levites, because the Levites won't get their own section of land because they're not part of the tribe. They'll have their own rules, just like they did in the camp. Now that we're entering into a land, they're going to have their own special way of serving and special place in which they reside. And then at the end, and it's the last thing in the book of Numbers, we actually return to those daughters of Zelophehad, because another issue has now come up with the rectification for the original issue. Is if the women own the land and they marry a man, then that man now owns the land too. But that means that if these daughters then marry into a different tribe, now we're going to have an imbalance. God gave this land to this tribe, but now it belongs to this tribe. That's a problem, isn't it?
Yep.
And Moses is like, yeah, that's a problem. I'm going to ask God. God, yes, that says yes. And that's why he gives a command that says if the women are going to take that inheritance, that they can choose to marry whoever they want as long as they're in the same tribe. And that way the land isn't transferred out of the tribe.
Awesome. Yeah.
So with that little loose end tied up, we close out the book of Numbers, which is a very interesting note to be ending on, personally, after everything that's happened. Now, this is a crazy book with a crazy sequence of events, and very difficult things happen, violent things happen, right? If you read through this, let me tell you, just so that you all know, when I read through this the first time, I was deeply troubled by this book. It was challenging to see this mess and to see the things that God has to do to deal with this mess. But I want to bring attention to, I mentioned earlier that there would be a key theme that is introduced to us in Numbers. And it's not that it didn't exist before, but Numbers is where it's put in bold capital letters.
At the end, yep.
Right. And it's what I realized as I personally wrestled with what goes on in this book. And I think it's really important that we do wrestle. The Bible's going to wrestle with us. We're going to wrestle with it because it's going to be difficult. Is that beyond just the violence that's going on, just the chaos that it feels, the feeling that I had that so deeply troubled me was this feeling, and maybe it is for a lot of other people, and that's why I wanted to bring it up, is the feeling that God's not in control, that this chaos he can't seem to get a handle on.
Yeah.
That no matter what happens and what he does, the people rebel again, they grumble again, they mess up again. And it feels, you could almost be convinced that God's fighting a losing battle with the human heart throughout this book.
Yep.
Like we've seen, like we're on the other side of the Torah. Things should be getting better now, right? I mean, he brought his people out of Egypt. He showed them signs. He proved to them his faithfulness. And yet we are rebelling against him still. And that was what was so deeply troubling to me, was this feeling of hopelessness that seems to come out of it. Of if this was the plan, God, if this was plan B, right? If plan A was, well, like in Genesis, when we flood the world and we start over with a righteous man and that fell apart immediately, if this was plan B, God, it's not working. I don't see it working. It's still chaos. It's still death. It's still people being terrible to one another and to you. It's still the human heart doing what the human heart does. What could solve this problem? Is there a solution to this problem?
Yeah.
And Numbers breaks down our feeling that in a way, it seems like it breaks down any hope that there's a solution to this problem. What it certainly breaks down is a hope and a solution that we can perceive, a hope and a solution that we would be able to come up with of ourselves. It seems hopeless to me as a human being. But there's one very key thing that's true at the end of the book that I realized. And that's the very simple fact that at the end of this chaos and mess, what seems like a mess of a sequence of events, Yahweh's still there.
Wow.
He's still there. He's still bringing them into the promised land. He's still tying up loose ends in their understanding of the law. He's still working with them.
Yeah, so profound.
And the only conclusion then that you can come to, if you're coming out, you don't know anything else that's going to happen in the Bible. You just started in Genesis and now you're in Numbers. You don't know what's going to happen. And this doesn't make it look like what's going to happen is going to be good. This isn't setting you up to be hopeful about the future of this group of people and God's work with them. But you're left to ask yourself, if it was hopeless, why would Yahweh still be there?
Yeah.
Why hasn't he just left? Why hasn't he carried out judgment and eliminated all of this wicked people? Yeah. Why is he still there? And the only answer you can come to is because there is a solution, because there is some kind of victory on the horizon, because Yahweh is in control and he does have a plan.
Yes.
And he's positioning. He's got to get these people into the promised land. We don't know what's going to happen after that, but there's something on the horizon. There's some plan, there's some play that God's going to bring about. And we're left to only be able to trust that that's the case, because why else would he still be there?
Yeah.
And if he does have that plan, and if he is still there with his people, then it's because of his unending love for these people. And that is the key theme that surprisingly comes out of Numbers for me, is God's loyal love.
Yeah.
After all the chaos, after all of the violence and all of the death, you can, at the end of it, when you think about it and the fact that he's still there, that Yahweh, that the great I am still is, it's because he loves them, because he loves us for some reason.
Yeah.
This book really makes you wonder why.
Yeah.
Why he's still there, but he is still there.
Yeah. And I think that just speaks to all of us, translate that now to, after Christ in our lives. And sometimes, we look at our own rebellion and you're like, sometimes we get to that point. Why is God still working with me? It's because he is the same God. It's a loyal love for us, and a loyalness to redeem his creation.
Mm-hmm. And that's what was so powerful for me when it struck me, was because I saw it immediately in my own life too.
Yeah.
How much I rebel and fail God all the time, and he's still there. Yeah. And why would he still be there? And I'm so inclined to feel like there's no hope for me.
Yeah.
Like my heart will always be this way. I will always struggle with these things. I'll always be inclined. But if that's true, why has God not abandoned me?
Yeah.
Because he hasn't.
Yeah.
And God is not stupid.
Yeah. Well, thank you, Ben. That was, I think, phenomenal, with a very challenging book. And so I appreciate you and your effort. Thank you, everyone who stood. I know it's pretty late, but thank you. We got still a great number of people on. Thank you. I pray that, these studies are just going to be a tool for you. We invite you to read if you haven't. There's so many things, like sometimes, some stuff we had to kind of leave out just for sake of time, but this is meant to be a tool. And so if you haven't read Numbers, hopefully this will be a great tool as you read, or if you did, now maybe you got some insight. Maybe you want to go back and read again. So thank you so much, Ben.
And as always, if you are attending TDP, you pull me aside and ask me about stuff. I really love to talk about this stuff, and I want to encourage everyone who's reading and is challenged by it, that it's okay to be challenged by it. It's in fact good to be challenged by it, and it's through letting yourself be challenged and bothered by it and wrestling with that at least personally I have had revelations and have built my relationship with God. Amen. So I just want to encourage all of you to not feel discouraged because something's difficult or because it troubles you. You're not a bad Christian for reading the Bible and being troubled by things. Numbers is designed to trouble you. It's troubling things. So please don't be discouraged, and come with us as we continue this journey, because the story is not over. Yes. Thank God.
Awesome. And anyone's question that we missed, I know we missed maybe a couple of questions, but Ben is available to have follow-up conversation. So let's just end the night with just some couple of announcements. So great to know that our church continues as well. Bible study is going to come to a close, but our fellowship won't. Join us this Thursday at 7:30 p.m. for our youth and young adult service, encounter night with the youth ministry, Unshaken Generation. It's always an incredible time. Then again, join us Sunday. We have prayer at 7 a.m. to 8, and then our service will begin at 10 a.m. And just some announcements to throw out there now. Our Good Friday service, we announced it's going to be Friday, April 7th at 7:30 p.m. We're going to be doing communion, partaking in the Lord's Supper together, followed by a potluck fellowship. If you're interested in participating and contributing to the potluck, please speak with Pastor Daniel. And of course, if we're announcing Good Friday, it is because Resurrection Easter Sunday will be that Sunday right after, April 9th at 10 a.m. under the theme Jars of Clay. So those are our announcements. God bless you guys. Thank you so much. We're going to be leaving right now, but you guys can say goodbye as we conclude. But thank you again so much, Ben, and to everyone that joined us. Have a wonderful night.
Good night, everyone.
Good night. God bless you. Thank you.